And so Jesus begins this with a question, what were you discussing on the way? He's wanting to know what their discussion was about. And then he's going to do something. He's going to redefine for them what greatness is. He's going to redefine for us what greatness is. So verse 35 says this, and he sat down and he called the 12. And he said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. Now, notice here, Christ doesn't put down as a whole the idea of seeking greatness. He says, hey, you're talking about greatness. If you want to be first, this is what you should do. He says you should be last of all and servant of all. So he doesn't put down the idea of greatness as a whole, but he's going to radically redefine how we see greatness. And he's going to redefine the way in which we reach greatness and our destination, our goal of what true greatness should actually look like. And so you can think about it like this. The disciples are not only going in the wrong direction, seeking the wrong way of greatness, they have the wrong destination. It's like you're trying to get to the beach and you're driving north to Canada. Maybe there's some good beaches up there. I don't know of any. But it would be much better if you were to fly to Hawaii. It's like if you're trying to get to the wrong destination the wrong way, that's what's happening here. Jesus saying, hey, your way of seeking greatness, you've missed it. And your goal of what greatness looks like, you've missed it. And so what's the way of greatness that Jesus is going to show us here? Well, we see it in the life of Jesus. He says, if you would be first, be last and servant of all. This is the way of greatness. And we talked about how Jesus is on the way to the cross. So he's going to Jerusalem. He's going to be handed over, crucified, and killed. But his life is one in which he comes not to be served, but to serve. And he comes to be humiliated and actually put down. And his path to greatness is one of utter humiliation on the cross. And this section of Mark is him on his journey to Jerusalem. And actually what's fascinating is right before this, right before the dispute in Mark 9:33, we see that Jesus tells his disciples that this is what he's about to do. So read with me Mark 9, verses 30 to 32. It says this, they went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days he will rise. But they did not understand the saying, and were afraid to ask him. Now consider this for a moment. Jesus has just told, and Mark puts these back to back, Jesus has just told his disciples, I'm going to be crucified. I'm going to be handed over, and in 3 days I'm going to rise from the dead. And Mark says, okay, now look at the conversation they're having. And what conversation are they having in verse 33? They're wondering about who's the greatest. And it says in verse 32, right before that they did not understand the saying and were afraid to ask him. And it's made very clear that they didn't understand because their conversation now is who is the greatest? It's like they're missing the point of Jesus' life and ministry, that it's not about self-promotion. It's not about becoming great in the eyes of man, but it's about serving and going low. As Jesus goes low, he becomes servant. He becomes last of all. He comes to serve and to bring up those who are low. So they miss the way of greatness. And they also miss the goal of greatness. Because greatness is not about being great in one another's eyes, comparing ourselves to one another. But ultimately, greatness is about seeking the glory of our Father in heaven. It is what Jesus shows so clearly in his life. He was not great in the eyes of man. He was humiliated. He was rejected. He was hated. And yet, what we see in Christ is true greatness, and where he is elevated to the right hand of his Father because of his suffering and death, because of his life in which he lives as last and least of all. He shows us what true greatness is. And it's not to seek the approval of man. And this is important because if we were just to redefine the way we seek greatness, we say, okay, well, in the church, greatness isn't about being first, it's about being last. Then we could just say, hey, do you see that I'm last in line? Do you see the way that I'm serving? Do you see the ways that I'm seeking the needs of others? And we just turn it into a game where it's still all about, do you see me? Do you see me? Do you see me? Do you see what I'm doing? But Jesus is saying, no, that's not what true greatness is like. It's to be a servant and last of all. And the example of Jesus' life makes clear that the glory we seek is not the glory of people, the praise and the recognition and the status from people, but is actually the status from our Father in heaven. And so Jesus redefines for us what greatness is. It's to be last and to be servant. And so we want to ask the question of ourselves, as we sit under Jesus' teaching, are we allowing the cross and the example of Christ to reshape our vision of greatness? Are we getting caught in the vision of greatness that our world has, of self-promotion, of comparison? Or are we willing to step into being servant and last of all? And so a few just diagnosis questions that we can consider is, one would be this: do I only serve people who seem worthy of my service or can repay me? Do I only serve people who I think, man, they're really worthy of my service? They're really going to recognize how important what I'm doing is for them, and they're going to thank me and return it. In gratitude or some ways that they'll repay me and show me that they're worth my service. Another question we could ask is, do I avoid certain people or relationships? Because I think some people just aren't worth my time. I'm not talking about people who maybe have done some harm and there's intentional reasons to stay away, but do we use some people in our family, in our community, our neighborhood, in our work is just not worthy of our time and energy? Do I get upset when people's needs disrupt my priorities? The life that Jesus is showing us here, where we become servant and last of all, is actually highly disruptive to our culture that idolizes productivity and efficiency. It's one in which we have to actually sacrifice our time, our plans, often to serve others and to go low, rather than merely seeking our own goals that seem like they would advance our plans. Am I willing to be treated as last? See, Jesus is trying to redefine for what greatness looks like. It's not to put ourselves above, but it's actually to serve and go low so that others might be brought up. And this is the example that we see so clearly in the cross. The cross is the paradigm. It's the picture, it's the image of how we know what true service looks like.